In 2001, the Game Boy Advance was still a relatively brand new system. Nintendo's latest handheld had more power than any portable console before it, but developers were still figuring out what the hardware was truly capable of. Most early Game Boy Advance games were still fairly simple, updated versions of older Game Boy titles or smaller experimental products built around the system's new capabilities. But one studio had something much bigger in mind. They wanted to create a true console-style RPG experience, but on a handheld system. They wanted a massive fantasy world, a deep integrative combat system, complex puzzles that were built into the environment itself, and a story that would span multiple games. That project would later become known as Golden Sun. Golden Sun was one of the most technically ambitious RPGs ever released on a handheld video game system. But Golden Sun didn't just appear out of thin air. Its development was the result of years of experience, a talented studio with RPG roots, and a very specific moment in gaming history. Today, I want to talk about the real history behind Golden Sun, how it was created, why it was decided to be split into two games, and how it became one of the most defining RPGs of the Game Boy Advanced era. The story of Golden Sun truly begins with the developers who made it, which was Camelot Software Planning. Camelot was founded in the early 1990s by brothers Hiroyuki and Shugo Takahashi. Before forming Camelot, they had worked at Sega, where they helped develop several entries into the Shining series, RPGs that were well known for their storytelling and tactical combat systems. Titles like Shining Force and Shining in the Darkness built Camelot's reputation as a studio that really understood the RPG genre deeply. But by the mid-1990s, Camelot's relationship with Sega began to shift, and the studio eventually started working with Nintendo instead. Their first projects with Nintendo weren't even RPGs at all. Instead, Camelot developed sports titles such as Mario Golf and Mario Tennis for the N64 and Game Boy Color. These games were successful and helped establish Camelot as a trusted partner for Nintendo moving forward, but the studio still wanted to return to what they loved most, which was making quality RPGs. So when the Game Boy Advance began development, Camelot started planning a new role-playing game that could showcase what the system could truly do. That game would later become known as Golden Sun. Golden Sun actually began development before the Game Boy Advance was even released. Camelot started working with early development kits while the system was still being finalized, so this meant that they had to design the game alongside hardware that was still evolving. The team's goal was ambitious: create a handheld RPG that felt as rich and cinematic as the console games did of the time. Remember that this was the era of games like Final Fantasy IX and Chrono Cross on the PlayStation, so console RPGs were growing larger and larger and more cinematic every year. Camelot wanted Golden Sun to deliver on this same sense of scale, but on a handheld device that could be played anywhere. This meant designing things like large animated enemy sprites, elaborate spell effects, a deep integrative class system, puzzle-heavy dungeon design, and a truly full-scale developed fantasy world. To achieve this, Camelot built custom tools and technology specifically for the Game Boy Advanced. The team behind Golden Sun pushed the system's sprite handling, animation, and battle presentation systems much further than majority of the Game Boy Advance titles that came out at the same time ever had dreamed of. But as development continued, they kept getting bigger and bigger, and the development kept getting more ambitious. Originally, Golden Sun was planned as one massive RPG. However, the Game Boy Advance used a cartridge storage system, which meant developers were limited by how much data they could physically fit inside the cartridge. So as Camelot continued adding story content, dialogue, complex animations, and gameplay systems, they ran into some serious hardware problems. The game simply wouldn't fit into the cartridge system. So rather than cutting large parts of the story, Camelot and Nintendo made a different decision. They split the game into two separate releases. The first game, Golden Sun, would introduce the world, characters, and the beginning of the story. The second game, Golden Sun: The Lost Age, would continue and complete that original narrative. This decision allowed the developers to keep their full vision intact, but it also created something unusual for the time, a handheld RPG where the story continued directly from one cartridge to the next. Players could even transfer their save data from the first game into the second using long passwords or the link cable system. This allowed characters, items, and progress to carry over between the two games. It was an impressive technical feat for a handheld RPG that released in 2001. Golden Sun was released in 2001 in Japan and North America shortly after the Game Boy Advance launched. At this time, the system didn't yet have many large RPG titles available, so because of that, Golden Sun quickly became one of the platform's most important titles. Critics praised several aspects of the game, including its detailed sprite animation, dramatic battle presentation, the puzzle-heavy dungeon design, and most importantly, its ambitious storytelling. Many reviewers also noted how much the game pushed the Game Boy Advanced hardware. Battles featured large enemy sprites, dynamic spell animations, and other systems that truly felt closer to a console RPG than a handheld one. However, one criticism did frequently appear in the reviews, and that was that the story seemed to end on a cliffhanger. Of course, this was intentional. Camelot had already planned the second half of the release, and that continuation arrived the following year. In 2002, Camelot released Golden Sun: The Lost Age. Rather than simply continuing the story from the same perspective, The Lost Age did something interesting. It shifted the player's viewpoint to the other side of the conflict. Characters who were initially presented as antagonists in the first game became the main playable party in the sequel. This narrative structure allowed the full story of the world to unfold from multiple perspectives. It also created a much larger world to explore. The Lost Age featured expanded gameplay systems, more djinns to collect, and additional summons and locations. When players imported their saved data from the first game, characters and story events connected across both titles. Together, the two games formed what was essentially one large RPG but split across two cartridges. After the initial success of the first two games, Golden Sun became one of the most recognizable RPG franchises on the Game Boy Advance. Fans praised it. Puzzle-based dungeon design, djinn class systems, large animated battle sequences, and detailed sprite artwork. For many players, it became one of the defining RPG's experiences on the Game Boy Advanced. Years later, Camelot returned to the series with Golden Sun: Dark Dawn for the Nintendo DS in 2010. While the game introduced new characters and mechanics, it didn't have the same appeal or level of popularity as the original titles. Even so, the original two Golden Sun games remain widely remembered as some of the most ambitious and best RPGs ever created for a handheld device. At the end of it all, Golden Sun's story is really a story about one studio's ambition to define the RPG genre on a new medium. Camelot Software Planning set out to create a handheld RPG that could rival console experiences of the time. And when their vision grew too large to fit on a single cartridge, they didn't scale it back. They expanded it into two games. The result was a pair of RPGs that pushed the Game Boy Advanced hardware to its limits, delivered a massive fantasy world, and left a lasting impression on players around the world for years to come. More than 2 decades later, Golden Sun is still remembered not just as a great RPG, but as an attempt to redefine what handheld games could be and what the limits of the Game Boy Advance could achieve. And in many ways, it succeeded. And there we have it, the history of Golden Sun. An ambitious project from Camelot that pushed the Game Boy Advance further than most people thought possible. What started as a simple RPG idea eventually became a 2-part adventure that defined an era of gaming and left a lasting impression on players more than 2 decades after its release. I'm curious what your thoughts are. Did you play Golden Sun when it first came out, or did you discover it years later? Do you think it still holds up, or are there other handheld RPG titles that you think have surpassed it? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments. If you liked this video, please consider subscribing to the channel, and please consider giving us a like, as it really helps the channel's reach. If you enjoyed this deep dive, then please let me know what you'd like to see more in the future. Until next time, that was my rant, and thanks for watching.